There are moments in the world of royalty when silence becomes louder than any statement, when public perception shifts not because of proven facts, but because of the stories people tell, the reactions they notice, and the tension they feel beneath the surface. And recently, the atmosphere around Meghan Markle has changed again. Not because of anything officially confirmed by the palace, but because of how the media, commentators, and royal watchers are interpreting her actions, her decisions, and the growing distance between her and the institution she once stepped into with extraordinary global attention. For years, people around the world saw her as a symbol of possibility, a fresh chapter, a modern voice, a new perspective entering one of the oldest families on earth. But with time, that image became layered, complicated, and surrounded by questions. Some argue she was misunderstood. Others believe she misunderstood the institution itself. And between those two worlds, a storm of opinions has grown louder with each passing month. Recently, commentators began to point out something unusual, a shift in tone coming from voices that once stayed silent. Journalists, royal correspondents, and insiders who typically avoided strong public statements have started to speak more boldly. Not with accusations, but with observations. Not with personal attacks, but with concerns about the growing divide between Meghan and the very system she once represented on the global stage. And this is where Tom Bower's name enters the discussion once again. Not because of scandal, but because whenever he speaks, the media listens. He has a reputation for being direct, uncompromising, and willing to highlight the parts of a public narrative that others avoid. In his recent commentary, he didn't present new accusations. He painted a picture of a relationship falling apart, a partnership between Meghan and the royal institution that never quite found stable ground. He described a clash of expectations, a mismatch of cultures, and a frustration that built up long before anyone walked away. Public reaction was immediate. Some said he was simply repeating what many were already thinking but never said aloud. Others felt he was being too harsh. But regardless of which side people stood on, one thing became clear. The discussion around Meghan's role, her influence, and her royal identity had entered a new phase. Even if nothing official was happening behind the scenes, the public conversation was shifting toward one uneasy question. What does the future of her title truly look like? Not because it will be removed. Not because the palace has made any decision. But because public perception shapes everything. When enough people begin to ask a question, that question becomes part of the story. It becomes part of the pressure. It becomes part of the identity. Commentators noticed a pattern. Whenever a major royal event approached, the spotlight turned back to Meghan, even if she was thousands of miles away. Every absence, every business venture, every public appearance became material for speculation. Some admired her independence. Others criticized her strategy. And yet others simply wondered whether the distance between her and the royal family was becoming permanent. Not physically, but symbolically. In the midst of all this, analysts pointed back to the Australia tour, the moment many believe was a turning point. Not because of scandal, but because it highlighted the difference between public excitement and private responsibility. The tour was a huge success with crowds, but behind the scenes, observers claimed there was tension, pressure, misunderstandings, and uncomfortable adjustments to royal protocol. These weren't accusations, they were reflections on how difficult it is for anyone, no matter how talented or charismatic, to suddenly step into a role that comes with centuries of rules, expectations, and traditions. Over time, these small moments added up. Not as official statements, but as parts of a larger narrative that analysts discuss again and again. A narrative of two worlds colliding, the world of Hollywood independence and the world of royal duty. Each with its own rhythm, its own expectations, its own limitations. As commentators connected these dots, the public conversation grew louder. Was Meghan's royal chapter ever meant to last? Was the role aligned with who she truly wanted to be? And most importantly, what does her future look like now that she is building a life far away from the institution that once defined her globally? These questions don't accuse. They simply explore the reality of how public stories evolve, how a narrative can shift from celebration to confusion, from admiration to debate, from unity to disagreement. And as more voices join the conversation, the story around Meghan transforms once again. Some say she is carving her own path and deserves full credit for refusing to be boxed in. Others believe she took on a role she never intended to fully embrace. And somewhere between those two views lies the truth, complex, nuanced, and shaped by years of pressure, media noise, and global attention. Today, the palace remains silent, as it always does. But the world is not silent. The commentators are not silent. And the public is definitely not silent. Whether fair or unfair, supportive or critical, the conversation around Meghan continues to grow. Powerful, emotional, and impossible to ignore. And for now, the biggest question is not about titles or decisions. It's about perception. Because in the world of royalty, perception often becomes reality. The story didn't calm down after that. In fact, it grew heavier, because what followed wasn't just public curiosity, it was a collision between two powerful forces, the global media machine and the unspoken rules of royal life. When these forces clash, no one walks away untouched. In the months that followed the couple's transition away from royal duties, commentators began noticing something subtle but undeniable. The public no longer saw Meghan only through the lens of a royal newcomer. They began viewing her through a more complicated filter, a blend of admiration, skepticism, inspiration, and debate. She became a symbol, a topic, a conversation point. And symbols are harder to manage than people. Every move she made was magnified. Every silence was interpreted. And every new project she launched was seen not just as a business decision, but as a statement, intentional or not. Experts often say that the moment someone steps into the royal circle, they are no longer just an individual. They become a part of a global narrative, a character in a story that the entire world feels entitled to analyze. And Meghan, whether she wanted it or not, became that character faster than almost anyone before her. What complicated matters further was the contrast between two styles of communication. The royal family follows a policy shaped over decades: speak rarely, act quietly, respond only when absolutely necessary. Meghan, on the other hand, came from a world where direct communication, openness, interviews, and personal storytelling were not only accepted, they were expected. This difference created a visible tension. Not from a scandal, but from a clash of cultures. Analysts pointed to small moments. A speech delivered with passion while royal tradition preferred subtlety. A headline interpreted as boldness while insiders expected restraint. A personal project viewed as empowering by fans and as disruptive by critics. None of these moments were dramatic on their own. But together, they built a larger narrative, one that made Meghan seem out of sync with the institution's rhythm. Not guilty of anything, simply different. And in an environment as structured as royalty, different can often feel like a challenge. As this perception grew, another issue rose to the surface: the pressure placed on Harry himself. Observers noted that he was caught between two worlds, the world he was born into and the world he chose with Meghan. Supporters admired his willingness to protect his family. Critics questioned his decisions. But no matter where people stood, everyone agreed on one thing: he was navigating a nearly impossible path. In this environment, each public appearance of Meghan seemed to create a new wave of conversation. Even when she stayed quiet, her absence became the headline. People began reading meaning into every detail. Why didn't she attend certain events? Why did she attend others? What was the message behind her latest project, outfit, speech, or partnership? These weren't controversies. They were interpretations. And interpretations build momentum in ways no one can fully control. Then came another shift: the rise of commentators comparing Meghan's journey to that of other royal women of the past. Not in a negative or harmful way, but in an analytical one. They asked whether the institution was prepared for someone with modern expectations. They questioned whether Meghan had underestimated the weight of royal protocol. And they wondered whether both sides had moved too quickly without fully understanding what the other needed. These reflections didn't portray Meghan as a villain. They portrayed her as a figure caught in the middle of an unprecedented cultural collision: modern individuality versus royal tradition. And while this discussion played out in newspapers, on TV panels, and across social media, another layer emerged: the question of public trust. Some viewers felt that Meghan was misunderstood and unfairly treated. Others believed she was trying to control her narrative too aggressively. Meanwhile, a third group simply felt lost, unsure who to believe, but fascinated by the unfolding story. This uncertainty created a vacuum, and vacuums always get filled, usually with speculation. That speculation led back to the topic everyone keeps circling around: her title. Not because it is at risk, not because any official action is being taken, but because the symbolism of titles holds immense emotional power. Titles represent unity, duty, and tradition. When someone steps away from those traditions, the world naturally wonders what that means for the title itself. And that is exactly what analysts are discussing: not decisions being made, but meanings being interpreted. They ask whether the title still represents what it was meant to, whether it still aligns with Meghan's identity today, whether it will remain a symbol of her link to the institution, or whether it will gradually become something more ceremonial and distant. None of this is official. None of it is confirmed. But perception is shaping the conversation more than anything else. Supporters argue she should keep the title indefinitely, as it reflects her history and her role during a transformative moment in modern royal life. Critics argue the title feels out of place now that she has built a separate brand, lifestyle, and career far away from royal duties. And analysts stand somewhere in between, examining how public opinion evolves faster than institutions do. Meanwhile, across all this noise, one thing becomes increasingly clear: Meghan has created her own world, her own platform, and her own direction. She no longer depends on royal events or appearances for relevance. She has built a new chapter, one that blends Hollywood storytelling, activism, media influence, and personal branding. And that independence, ironically, is part of why the conversation around her title still refuses to die down. People are fascinated by the idea that someone could leave the system yet remain connected to it in name. It challenges old assumptions. It breaks old patterns. And it makes everyone wonder what the future holds. The palace remains silent. They watch, they observe, they never react publicly. But the world doesn't work like that anymore. When millions of people discuss a story, the silence becomes part of the story. In the end, this entire situation isn't about scandal or wrongdoing. It's about perception, identity, and the nearly impossible challenge of balancing individual freedom with centuries of tradition. Meghan stands right at the center of that struggle, and that is why the world continues to watch her so closely. And this story, whether people love her or criticize her, isn't slowing down anytime soon.